Subcommittee on Elections of the Committee on House Administration will now come to order. As I said a few moments ago, good morning to all of you, and thank all of you so very much for coming and participating in this very important hearing. As I say in all of our field hearings across the country, this is not a political event. This is an official event sponsored by the Committee on House Administration, U.S. House of Representatives. Serious hearing, all about collecting and gathering information that would be valued to us as we legislate and try to protect the election. As we begin this morning, I want to note the hearing in compliance with regulations for committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution number 8. So I'm going to ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recess in the subcommittee at any day, and that all members have 5 legislative days of which to advise and extend their remarks and have any written statement be made part of the record. I hear no objection, therefore. I am hearing that right. I don't that. That's all. Additionally, I ask unanimous consent from the monitor. Can that be muted? We know. All right. Technically, people kind of pay attention, but can't be resolved, can't be resolved. But I ask unanimous consent that Congresswoman Melanie Stansberry, dear friend of the House, she represents the 1st Congressional District of this great state. I ask unanimous consent that she be invited to join the subcommittee today. Of course, I hear an objection. Therefore, let me also say thank you to our colleague, Congresswoman Teresa Ledger Fernandez. We have really developed a strong relationship with a few months. She has been with us in Congress. As we all know, she represents the 3rd Congressional District of Mexico. So thank her for warmly receiving us today in Santa Fe and thank us for that. Let me say finally to the Mexico State Capitol, thank you for us today. You know, the governor of the state served together in the House years ago. It's just a delight to be in her state and in her capital and legislate for us, make this beautiful facility available. Thank you for opening your doors to us. We are here today to examine voting access to the ballot in the state of Mexico. While many states have sought to correct barriers that curb access to the ballot in recent years, this great state, Mexico, this great state has moved in the opposite direction by improving access to the ballot box for all of your voters. Mexico has successfully implemented pro-democracy policies such as online registration, automatic same-day registration, 2 weeks early in-person voting, and no excuse absentee voting. That is in response to the COVID-19 pandemic during the 2020 election, county clerks were authorized to automatically mail absentee ballot applications to eligible voters for the November general election. The number of voters voted by mail more than tripled in the 2020 election. Mexico saw the largest voter turnout in recent days. All of these improvements in voter access in Mexico were achieved while maintaining the integrity and security of the election. But the state's leadership has not stopped working to expand access to the branch, putting forth policy this year that will continue increasing access, such as creating a permanent absentee voter list, supporting the rights of indigenous voters by expanding time for requesting alternate voting, and automatically restoring voting rights of those convicted of a felony who are not currently in custody. Progress that Mexico has made and continues to push for stands in stark contrast to the anti-democratic laws passed in far too many of the states, including my home state of North Carolina. The ability to cast a ballot free, undeterred, and discrimination is the cornerstone of our participatory democracy. It should not be determined by geography, but it should be free, fair, and equitable for every single American, which is why Democrats push for many of these same policies as national debt. And so, with all of that said, I look forward to hearing today's witnesses about how the state of New Mexico has access to the ballot for voters throughout their state, and continuing to work with my colleagues to ensure every voter can receive the same access to the ballot all across. With that said, I will now be delighted to recognize Congresswoman Ledger Fernandez, Mexico's 3rd Congressional District, for any opening statement that she would like.
Chair Butterfield, thank you so much. Bienvenidos a New Mexico. Welcome to New Mexico. And to my fellow New Mexicans, I'm very excited to bring our committee's work to you, but more importantly, to share New Mexico's rich voting history and, yes, struggle to overcome our problems with Congress. As many of you know, I've spent much of my career expanding access to the ballot for Latinos, for Native Americans, and for all New Mexicans as we strive to our democracy. Because the right to vote is precious. The right to have easy access to the ballot is essential to vibrant democracy. As we see in Europe, a democracy is the best answer to tyranny, aggression, and depravity. But the threats to democracy abroad and at home are real. Our love for this amazing experiment of participatory democracy begun over 2 centuries ago must give rise to a fierce desire and determination to protect it. But democracy is not something static. It did not flow from the Constitution perfect, but rather was quite imperfect when it was begun. But to seek a more perfect and engage in that beautiful pursuit of happiness, that implies that we are called upon to work to protect our democracy. That's how we realize the aim, justice, and blessings of liberty. Indeed, in the long journey towards a more perfect democracy, we've made sure that women, Black Americans, Latinos, those without land holdings, and as late as the 1960s, because it did take us a long time to ensure that Native Americans had a vote. Yet there are those that fight hard against our work to perfect our democracy, who wish to subvert it, limit it, and restrict it. In 2020, we saw historic turnout where, for example, 4 million more Latinos voted than ever. And Native Americans and Latinos were decisive in Arizona, in Mexico, and in many other states. But in response, instead of celebrating this increase of democratic participation, our neighboring states and so many others like Arizona and Texas to restrict voter access. But I'm so proud that New Mexico did just the opposite. And I think that there can be a beautiful symbiotic relationship between New Mexico, what we do here, and what we do at the federal level. The Elections Clause of the Constitution gives Congress the right to determine federal elections law, especially if a state undermines federal elections. Because our founders, and if you read the Federalist Papers, they point out their worry that states would seek to undermine the ability of Congress. And one of the things I love in those Federalist Papers is that they say that Congress should be a perfect mirror portrait of what America is. And sometimes I think we are seeing voter restrictions to ensure that that portrait does not reflect America. But we can take lessons from New Mexico and incorporate them into federal law. For example, when New Mexico, a while back, not now, but when New Mexico was denying voters in rural Native American communities access to early voting, which was causing long lines on voting day, I went to our then wonderful and fierce Speaker Lujan and told him I could bring a Voting Rights Act claim, we could litigate it, and I would win. The Native Americans would win. Rural Mexico would win. But we know that's not how we do stuff here. So instead of litigation, we had legislation. we drafted and passed the first bill to require early voting access to Native Americans on their reservations if they chose it. That was the first, but not the last. But this experience in New Mexico led me to the requirement that no one should wait more than 30 minutes to vote, and that's a requirement that we now find in the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act that we will get enacted. So over the last year, to respond to the Shelby decision and to craft the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act, our subcommittee has examined voting laws across the country. As noted, numerous states have passed laws to make it difficult for people of color to vote. Those range from closing polling places in Black and Latino communities, which would make those lines longer and much longer than the 30 minutes that we have prescribed in our act. It would purge voting rolls, and sadly, we have seen much attack on new citizens. These are insidious and targeted, very targeted to those who voted and made difference in the last election. And too often, proponents justify them under the complete false guise of preventing election fraud, because we know that the last election was the most secure, had almost nil election fraud. So today, as a majority-minority state with large Latino and Native American populations, New Mexico can show us the way towards a more inclusive and fair democracy. But we also know that we still have problems in New Mexico. It's not that we are perfect, but it is that we are going to address those issues. We're going to hear about some of them today. We are going to look to not say, let's address them by restricting access. Let's address them by targeting the problem, by naming it and working on it to solve it. So I think that that is how we aspire to that more perfect union our founders envisioned. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what the rest of America can learn from Nuevo Mexico. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Start over. Before I introduce our witnesses today, as a reminder, each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes, more or less. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. The record will remain open for at least 5 days for additional material to be submitted. Joining us today, we have 4 witnesses. Our first witness is, and if I pronounce some of these names correctly, please charge it to my head and not to my heart. I'm from the South. I'm from the rural part of North Carolina. Different. But let's say Ms. Dawn Chavez, and I pronounce your first name. Please help me. Ahtza Chavez, the NAVA Education Project, and Heather Ferguson, Common Cause, Maggie T. Oliver, Distinguished Secretary of State for New Mexico, and finally Andrea Serrano of Welly, and we'll talk about that in just. Ms. Dawn Chavez is the Executive Director of NAVA Education Project and its sister organization, Mexico Native Vote. In this role, she oversees organizations tasked with educating and creating an indigenous voting bloc in New Mexico. In this role, she oversees organizations tasked with educating and creating an indigenous voting bloc in New Mexico, working with key organizations and governors within the state. Our next witness, Heather Ferguson. Heather serves as Executive Director of Common Cause in New Mexico. Her work focuses on developing policy initiatives, managing legislative strategy, elected official outreach, and coalition building to advance the mission of the organization. Since first joining Common Cause as its legislative director some 8 years ago, she led her team's efforts to accomplish passing reforms, including creation of the state's Ethics Commission, automatic and same-day voter registration, and updating New Mexico's public financing program. And next, we have Maggie T. Oliver. Maggie is Mexico's 26th Secretary of State. She has served the people's great state in this role since first being elected in 2016. She is also the immediate past president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. Prior to becoming Secretary of State, she was first appointed to public office in 2007, when she became county clerk in Mexico's largest county. And last but not least, Andrea is the executive director of Organizers in the Land of Enchantment. That's what OLE stands for. Say it again. Organizers in the Land of Enchantment. She is an Albuquerque native who has been working in nonprofit and social justice organizations since 1999. She began working at OLE in 2012 as an organizer focused on conservation and is now executive director of the organization, leading the organization's political and electoral work. Right, quite an introduction, quite a panel. We will start now with our first witness, Ahtza Chavez. Like left and right. My script inverted, but I like left and right. Hope I'm not catching you off guard, but you should go first.
Thank you. Ahtza Chavez Yunishe, ik anyi el giwamisuta. Thank you, Chairman Butterfield, ranking and distinguished members of the committee for holding this important hearing today. I'm honored to be here with you and Representative Ledger Fernandez. Thank you for all your efforts in the committee, and it's good to see you, Representative Stansberry. My name is Ahtza Chavez. I am Diné from Sanasti, New Mexico, born for Kiwa Pueblo. I'm the Executive Director of NAVA Education Project, a 501c3 organization. Since the inception of our organization, its work has focused on creating economic prosperity, protecting sacred sites and national landmarks, and expanding votership for Native American working families through grassroots community organizing. NAVA EP was founded in 2010, but our roots go back to the 1990s and the fight to prevent the expansion of a highway through the Petroglyph National Monument on the west side of Albuquerque. The petroglyphs are a place of prayer and hold deep significance to Pueblo peoples. An intertribal and multicultural coalition of community organizers successfully prevented construction for several years. We are aware of the need to mobilize and actively promote civic engagement among Native Americans. This led to the registration of approximately 5,000 voters, a majority of which were Native American, who were able to defeat a street bond for the first time in over 20 years. Fortunately, soon after, there was a mass purge of the voter rolls, and over 80% of those registrants were new. Mayor Martin Chavez placed the bond on the ballot in 2005 and paved the way for the destruction and displacement of a large portion of the petroglyph escarpment. This battle and subsequent desecration of one of our most significant and revered sacred sites was a formative experience that led us to become the organizations that we are today. Our present organizational structure includes a 501c3 and 501c4, allowing us to build up issues, perform education, and to work in and between election cycles to advise Native American communities on pertinent issues and to build their understanding and engagement. We are based out of Albuquerque and Shiprock, Mexico, but actively collaborate with communities from all 20 tribes, nations, and pueblos, as well as the urban Native populations. For many of us, our voting experience is not something which has been a welcome right. Rarely is votership something which we have a long positive family history of doing. The actual right to vote for many of Native Americans is relatively new, and many of us have living family members without the right. In New Mexico, during the 2020 primary elections, despite historically high turnout, Native communities face massive challenges which highlighted the inequities in our election. New Mexico has the third largest percentage of AIAN residents, and Albuquerque has the sixth largest population of urban AIAN residents in the nation. New Mexico's Native population has had to contend with significant obstacles to prevent them from full political participation. These obstacles include, but are not limited to, geographic isolation, physical natural barriers, or non-existing rules, technological barriers, low-level educational attainment, depressed social economic conditions, homelessness, housing insecurity, non-traditional mailing addresses, lack of resources, and discrimination. In addition to the vast inequities that Native peoples face year after election year, our communities were overwhelmed and devastated by the COVID-19 pandemic. For a time, the Navajo Nation had the highest per capita rates of infections and deaths. The devastating loss of life and spread of illness forced tribal leaders to make the impossible choice between conducting elections that will affect every aspect of our future and between the survival of our languages and cultures and traditional practices. We had to fight against an election code which was outdated. During the 2020 primary, we saw dozens of polling sites close, a lack of broadband access, and poor rural addressing. As a result, turnout dropped to 80% in many of our communities, even those with a strong history of engagement. Fortunately, the special session in 2020 allowed some provisions that made this a little bit easier. The fixes that were made in 2020 were very helpful in preventing many of the worst outcomes, and the provisions were mostly temporary and set to expire in January. This meant that for NM Native Vote, it was an opportunity to continue to push for equity ensuring legislation by codifying some of these crucial changes through the legislative process. We were able to ensure that tribal polling locations could remain open even if a tribe utilizes their sovereign right to close their tribal borders, as they did during the pandemic to prevent the community. We hope to continue safeguarding voter access by adding greater resources for conducting elections on tribal land, while also creating a cleaned up and consolidated election that refers specifically to tribes, nations, and public. Many of the provisions which we stand in support of are not specific to tribal communities, as the national trend to limit voter participation and general voter access will continue to disproportionately affect Native people, voters, and communities of color. In January 2020, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham and New Mexico State Secretary Maggie Toulouse Oliver announced an expansive piece of voting right legislation that would be introduced. That was Senate Bill 8, commonly referred to as New Mexico Voting Rights Act. It contained numerous provisions that garnered the support of diverse communities, and together organizations mobilized communities across the state to support NMVRA, which would have expanded votership to many more voters than ever. It would have removed many barriers for registration and voter access, and unfortunately, that bill did not pass, dying on the table at the finish line thanks to a partisan filibuster. However, we will continue to work for greater voter participation and access. As a state, we are moving in the right direction to cut red tape and empower communities who have historically been shut out. As an organization which is rooted in promoting a better, more functional society for Native people, we have an obligation to the principles of democracy. Everyone deserves a vote. We have an obligation to do better and make sure that everyone has equal access to participating and electing our leader. As people,
I have to ask you to wrap it up.
Sure. As people who are interested in uplifting the voices of our community, we can move forward with care and respect to the sanctity of the vote. We can do this while expanding votership and making sure that every voter has the same access to all of their essential rights, regardless of race, gender, and experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Ferguson, Director 5.
Thank you, Chairman Butterfield, Ranking Member Stile, and distinguished members of the committee for holding this important hearing today. I am honored to be here with Representative Leger Fernandez in her district and thank her for her terrific work on this committee. Thank you, Representative Stansberry, for also being here today and for your strong record on democracy issues. My name is Heather Ferguson, and I am the Executive Director of Common Cause New Mexico. We are a state chapter of a national, nonpartisan, pro-democracy organization with more than 1.5 million members and 30 state chapters, including over 12,000 members here in New Mexico. For over 50 years, Common Cause has been holding power accountable through lobbying, litigation, and grassroots organizing. For years, we have worked together to put those who put country over party to advocate to pass major democracy reforms that sought to correct some of the most egregious abuses of power. These include the Federal Election Campaign Act, the Presidential Public Financing System, and the Ethics in Government Act. Before I continue, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for our Secretary of State, Maggie Toulouse Oliver, her staff and county clerks and poll workers for their hard work to ensure the success and security of our election process. New Mexico stands out as a beacon of light in stark contrast to the voter suppression laws that have passed in legislative chambers across the country. Today I will highlight our current election policies, election protection program, and our continuing work. Working with our community coalition partners in 2019, New Mexico successfully passed same-day voter registration and front-end automatic voter registration. These reforms make voting more convenient, and they lower unnecessary barriers to participation. For over a decade, New Mexico has allowed for an early voting process that commences 28 days prior to Election Day. And subsequently, we have worked with our coalition and the Secretary of State's office to pass legislation to allow for statewide voting convenience centers. Voting should not be an endurance sport. We have allowed for no-excuse absentee voting since 1993 and pre-registration for 17-year-olds since 2017. In our recent 30-day legislative session, 2 bills were introduced to improve our elections: the New Mexico Voting Rights Act and SB 144, which sought to address the intimidation and harassment of election workers. While neither of these bills passed this year, we look forward to their introduction next year. The details of these policies are addressed in my written testimony. For over a decade, Common Cause New Mexico has led a nonpartisan election protection program with over 1,000 trained volunteers at polling locations throughout the state. We focus our efforts and resources on areas that we have determined to be most vulnerable to increased voter intimidation, misinformation campaigns, and have historically experienced electoral suppression. A key factor in our program is that we work with upwards of 25 civic organizations who collaborate to provide New Mexico residents with the proper information needed to register to vote and cast their ballot. 2 of these organizations are represented here with me today on this panel, Ballot and New Mexico Native Vote. We are already in the process of recruiting volunteers for both our primary and general elections this year. Although New Mexico has set an example nationally for protecting and expanding the freedom to vote, we are not immune from efforts by certain self-interested politicians who want to make it harder to vote here. New Mexico has seen its share of legislation attempting to suppress the vote of qualified voters. I have seen this to be especially true for our Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Common Cause, alongside our allies, continue to fight back against legislation that seeks to silence voters and harm the democratic process. We support strong national standards to protect our freedom to vote and commend this committee for its leadership and effort. While we are fortunate to have so many strong pro-voter reforms in New Mexico, Congress has the power to close the gap and disparity in states where voting access is becoming more restricted and discriminatory, and to ensure that all of our fellow Americans have free and fair access to the ballot. We are appreciative of our home state representatives Leger Fernandez and Stansbury and Senators Heinrich and Lujan for their strong support of the For the People Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, to guarantee strong national voting standards, no matter one's race, age, or zip code. We are also grateful to Chairman Butterfield and for the work of the majority of this committee for their leadership in crafting, voting, and speaking out publicly to pass these critical bills. You have been central to the House's work to pass these bills this Congress and in the 116th Congress. We hope that your colleagues in the Senate can continue its work to reform the filibuster and pass these overwhelmingly popular bills, because protecting our sacred right to vote far outweighs any Senate procedure. Democracy is resilient, but only hard work protect it. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. I look forward to questions.
Right, so now repeat that.
Yes, please.
I go home.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Oliver, you have 5 minutes.
Very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I'm Maggie Toulouse Oliver, New Mexico Secretary of State. Thank you for coming to the state and bringing the subcommittee here. Welcome. Thank you so much to my Congresswoman Leger Fernandez, and my friend and colleague, Representative Stansbury. I'd also like to take a brief moment to thank our county clerks throughout the state and our poll workers for all of the hard work they do to manage elections, in addition to my staff here in Santa Fe. As mentioned, I've served as an election official here in New Mexico for 15 years as a multi-year officer of the National Association of Secretaries of State, as well as a founding and ongoing member of the Election Infrastructure Subsector Government Coordinating Council under CISA, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency within the Department of Homeland Security. Thank you again for organizing this hearing on ballot access in New Mexico and for your invitation to appear before you today. The current national discourse about voting in elections has been infected with a disturbing amount of misinformation about how elections are run and about the measures in place to secure the vote. Hearings like this one today are a great opportunity to educate the public on the complex, difficult, and vitally important work that election administrators engage in every day to keep the gears turning on our democracy. As New Mexico's Secretary of State since 2016, I have been dedicated to the dual tasks of increasing access to the ballot while maintaining and expanding the high levels of election security and integrity we employ for, during, and between every election. Ballot access and ballot security do not come at the expense of one another, and we in New Mexico prove that point during every election. Ballot access begins with making voting as easy as possible for all eligible voters, and the first step in that process is voter registration. As already mentioned, in New Mexico, we provide easy online voter registration, same-day voter registration, and automatic voter registration at the vehicle division, which are best practices in election administration that allow for more people to register while also creating efficiencies for election administrators responsible for processing those registrations and keeping records up to date. Although policies like same-day registration are sometimes presented as giving an unfair advantage to Democrats, I should note that more Republican voters utilized same-day registration in the 2020 general election than any other party. We also provide those 16 and 17 years of age the opportunity to register if they will be 18 by the next election, as Ms. Ferguson mentioned, which is an innovative policy designed to get young people participating in democracy as early as possible in their lives. These different voter registration options were particularly useful for voters during the pandemic, as COVID-19 complicated many aspects of election administration. During 2020, my office worked alongside our state's county clerks, the governor, and members of the legislature to provide voters with multiple options to register and vote during the pandemic. Many of those pandemic policies have been subsequently made permanent, like those that were enacted to protect Native voters, but many still need to be made permanent. Other election best practices we employ, like multiple weeks of early voting, secure monitored ballot containers, no excuse vote by mail, and online vote by mail online vote by mail ballot requests are also vital components of making it as easy as possible for eligible voters to participate in our democracy. New Mexico's commitment to ballot access does not come at the expense of election security, however, as we are nationally known as a leader in protecting the integrity of every vote. As I mentioned earlier, it is a fallacy to assume that ballot access must come at the expense of election security. I like to say we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Our work to strengthen our cybersecurity and election security in New Mexico has been an ongoing process over many years that has involved a strong coalition of local, state, and federal partners. We protect our elections in New Mexico through an array of low and high-tech solutions that have been proven to be formidable tools in the modern threat landscape election administrators face today. My office has a dedicated election security team that works with our county clerks to test our information security defenses on a regular basis and provide ongoing support to county election administrators. Additionally, our election security team works with government and private partners who validate and test our information security defenses. Such assessments include reviews of documentation and process, as well as varying degrees of computer and network hacking. Any identified issues are rapidly mitigated and corrected. During elections, we also partner with our New Mexico Air National Guard as they assist us with passive threat analysis. My remarks are running slightly long, so let me conclude with a few other points. We also conduct a risk-limiting audit following every general election. This process involves the random selection of races and precincts throughout the state by the independent auditing firm that we contract with, and then hand recount those ballots to ensure that those results match the results that were published on election night. If any discrepancy is found, additional hand counts will be required. I hope this overview of how we balance ballot access with election security in New Mexico is helpful for the committee and your future work. I thank you again for giving me this opportunity to testify on these important matters on behalf of New Mexico and our state's election administrators, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And we thank you, and please be assured that your written testimony will be part of the record and it will be published. Thank you. All right, Serrano, your turn.
Good morning, Chair Butterfield and members of the subcommittee, and welcome home, Representative Ledger Fernandez and Representative Stansbury. My name is Andrea Serrano, and I'm the Executive Director of OLE, as well as one of 3 co-chairs of the Working Families Party National Committee. OLE is a member-based, multi-issue organization focused on workers' rights, early education for all, raising professional wages for early educators, assisting permanent residents to gain their citizenship, and building an inclusive democracy. I'm honored to be testifying before you today about voting in New Mexico, particularly about Chicano, Latino, and Hispanic voters. The importance of voting and community action is something that was instilled in me early on. My grandmother, Ahtza Chavez, was born before New Mexico gained statehood and before some women were given the right to vote. She served as a ward chair in her district in the 1940s. My mom, Zenaida, was an active member of the union, and my father, Anselmo, was a former state representative. When I turned 18, the first thing my parents did was make sure I was registered to vote. And I cast my first vote, in the 1996 presidential election. As a Chicana, I know that my vote carries the weight of my community and the decisions that affect us. People of color are 63% of New Mexico's population. We are years ahead of what the U.S. Census projects will be the majority population of the United States by 2045. People of color have a long history in this state. Indigenous tribes have been on this land since time immemorial, and present-day Latinos span time. Some families have been here centuries before the Southwest was part of the United States. Others are first-generation citizens, and others are immigrants and refugees who have made New Mexico their home. New Mexico is not a tricultural state. Black, Asian, and Pacific Islander communities have also called New Mexico home for generations. Despite being a people of color majority state, voter turnout in 2018 was only 36% people of color and 38% in 2020. This is cause for alarm, given that the electorate does not match the population of the state and voters of color are underrepresented in democracy. A history we are all reckoning with in the U.S., including New Mexico, is that structural racism and economic inequality have limited participation in the formal system of democracy. The question of who has the structural power to change, participate in, and benefit from our economy, social norms, and electoral system are the key indicators of whether or not our democracy is inclusive. While there are many factors that contribute to low voter turnout among people of color, it's important that we do not pigeonhole voters as apathetic or uninformed. It is imperative that we take steps like the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the New Mexico Voting Rights Act to address underrepresentation of people of color in our democracy. In 2021, the People's Power People's Maps Coalition worked to ensure that race equity was at the center of New Mexico's redistricting process. The coalition, convened by the Center for Civic Policy, was made up of several community partners, focused on ensuring that the voices of people of color across the state were heard. The result was the People's Map, which was one of 3 maps recommended to the New Mexico legislature by the Citizens Redistricting Committee, and that map ultimately informed the final map adopted by the state legislature. This map ensures greater representation of communities of color in all 3 congressional districts and encourages participation in our democracy. Since we opened in 2009, OLE has assisted over 1,000 permanent U.S. residents in their process of becoming U.S. citizens. Many of our members came to the United States and have raised families and been active members of their communities. Taking the step of citizenship is not an easy one. The bureaucracy can be overwhelming and confusing. OLE is a space where people can study for their exam, meet with an immigration attorney, and be celebrated when they take their oath. One of the best parts of our program is helping our members register to vote, and sometimes even going to cast our votes together. As one member said, he never dreamed he would be able to vote since he left Mexico as a young man and never voted there. His vote and the votes of thousands of others must be protected. The experiences of Latinos in New Mexico are varied, and we are not a monolith. Our favorite saying at OLE is nothing about us without us is for us. Democracy means all of us, and as New Mexico continues to be a leader in democracy reform, we continue to place a priority on building an inclusive democracy where all voices are heard and all New Mexicans thrive. Thank you.
And we thank you, and we thank all of our witnesses for their testimony. Now time, member questions. This is always the exciting part of any field hearing. Under the protocol, usually the chair goes first, but I'm going to today go last. Recognize you first, Ms. Ledger. Frank, 5 minutes.
I'm going to borrow your.
I think mine is working
I
better
think
than
yours is working better. Can everybody hear me? Or we've been told by our wonderful election staff. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
I planned to take a break. I didn't realize. And to a reporter, judge years ago, I had one. I would have to take a break from time to time to give them some relief, but we're well staffed today. So take the time. So let's proceed.
Okay, we'll proceed with
Let's
questions.
restart the clock. Yes. Thank you.
So
You know, it reminds me when we went to,
we're going to have to restart the clock again, but yeah.
I went with President Obama to Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. Little did you know, certified, not doing. But I've been assured today that these are well qualified. Well qualified. Reset the clock a minute.
Well, on that note, I think maybe I will start the clock talking about the diversity of our state, and indeed in my district. My district is 20% Native American, and we did see that we had higher participation in the general election, not by as much as we had hoped, but we increased Native American participation by 3 percentage points, which is great, right? And it means we have a whole lot more work to do. But Ms. Chavez, so the Native American Voting Rights Act, Federal Native American Voting Rights Act, we incorporated much of that into the John Lewis Freedom to Vote Act. And it would require that Native Americans have the right to designate a tribal building for their residential address. And in your written testimony, you talked about the importance and how difficult it is in places that don't have regular residential addresses than others. Could you explain why having something like that is important? Why we can't rely on a physical address when you're on a Pueblo or on a reservation?
Sure, thank you for the question. Many of our communities lack post offices on the Navajo Nation, for example, and some of our Pueblo communities who have post offices still are miles away from where people actually reside. So having a tribal or an administrative building that's allowed to be the address for a lot of these folks who are wanting to vote by ballot is really important, because it allows those ballots to go to that central location, and then the tribes themselves can dictate how they can pick those up or how those can be managed. Without that, if someone wanted to vote by absentee ballot without a deliverable address, that is not an option. So you have many voters who work off hours or are not able to go in to a polling location on election day, so that limits their access to be able to vote. In addition to that, especially on the Navajo Nation, you have Navajo Nation elections where their polling locations are in one area, and then you have state or federal elections where their polling locations are in another area. So even if you wanted to vote in both elections, a lot of times that means you're spending half of the day traveling to get to these polling locations. So being able to vote absentee in one of them really increases the amount of votership that we have.
Thank you very much. And I think that what you've just pointed out is that our job is to make it easier for voters to vote, whether it's in a tribal election or federal election. Tribes will do what they want, but our job is to make sure there is ballot access and ballot security. I have lots of questions for the Secretary of State, but I wanted to go to Ms. Serrano. And in other states, in fact, we just recently had a hearing, as I pointed out, where in Texas, they were targeting new citizens for purging in the purging voter. And you just described the importance and what the work you do to ensure that new citizens are able to vote and have the right to vote. Can you describe whether targeting new citizens would have a chilling effect and why?
It absolutely would have a chilling effect, and thank you, Representative, for that question. Our experience has been that many people who become new citizens are actually part of mixed status families. And so when we're talking about one person who's become a citizen, it's likely that there are still family members who aren't even permanent residents yet. Or some people may be citizens and others may not be. And so to target new citizens and purge them from the voter rolls, what it does is it creates this atmosphere of fear, and it creates this sort of idea that somehow you've done something wrong. You've done something wrong by simply being registered to vote. And so when we talk about protecting the vote, it's important, and I think that Secretary Toulouse Oliver spoke so wonderfully about the way that our voting is secure. That, and that's a fact. Voting is secure in the United States, and in New Mexico, we take great steps to make sure that voting is secure. But when we started to create this fear, especially among new citizens, many of whom are people of color, we start to create this narrative, and it's dangerous. It's dangerous for people because when you start to target people, and it's this official target from the state or from the government, then it pushes people into the margins, and it prevents people from participating in democracy, and that's why that protection matters.
Thank you. And I am almost out of time. I will leave my questions for the next two witnesses on our second round.
You're the host.
Okay. Well, I did want to ask Ms. Ferguson that election officials are creating increased harassment, and we've seen a lot of disinformation. In fact, we had a hearing in Florida about the disinformation specifically targeted to Spanish speakers, and how that disinformation in Florida is then exported, sort of cleaned up, like there's a laundering effect on disinformation, then imported into New Mexico. What do you think are the most effective ways to prevent disinformation?
I think that one of Mr. Chair and Representative Leger Fernandez, I think that one of the most important ways that we can do that is through misinformation monitoring systems. I know that our national office, Common Cause, will be doing a very robust program during the national elections coming up, as well as some local organizations are also doing misinformation, I would call them mining campaigns. So these are going to be individuals who are going to be monitoring social media accounts, looking for misleading information either about candidates, about voting locations. That is one of the issues that has shown up prevalently in previous elections. And our Secretary of State's office has been lightning fast at assuring that those are immediately addressed. I remember a couple years ago when we had some mass texts going out that were giving out incorrect polling locations to the residents of the city of Albuquerque, that immediately she engaged the Department of Homeland Security and at the FBI to investigate where those were coming from and to put a stop to those. These were ones that had been supposedly promulgated or sent out to voters from our, at the time, city clerk. So it's campaigns like that I think we identify.
Thank you very much, and I'll yield back.
Young lady yields back. All right, Ms. Stansberry, take it away. Now, we are in the House of Senate.
I was, in fact, in this very body, in this very committee that we're sitting in today. Yes,
Right?
I am. It's great to be back.
Also,
Yes,
sort of.
sort of.
Yeah.
I'm here at the pleasure of the committee, but it's an honor to be here. So thank you for letting me be here today. All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you once again, Chairman Butterfield, and to Representative Leger Fernandez for your leadership and for convening this important hearing on such an important topic, which is, of course, access to the ballot box and voting rights here in New Mexico. And it's such a joy and an honor to be with all of you this morning here in my old stomping grounds, as I just said, with so many friends. And I just want to take a moment of personal privilege and say, how awesome is it that we're here with this incredible panel of women leaders who are leading voting rights in the state of New Mexico. We are indeed blessed here in this state to have such incredible leadership. And as legislatures across the country have been working to undermine voting rights, I am proud to be in my home state where we have been working to increase access and strengthen voting rights, led by our amazing Secretary of State, our governor, who's upstairs, tribal leaders, local leaders, and organizations across New Mexico, many of whom are here today. I am proud to be from a state that understands that voting rights are the foundation of our democracy and must be protected. And I am proud to have been a member of this legislature as we pass some of the most important voting rights legislation being discussed here today, including bills to expand voter registration, access to the ballot, and voting rights across our communities. While we are not without our own challenges, as we're discussing here today, New Mexico is indeed at the forefront of voting rights across the country. I want to thank the committee for beginning your field hearing work here in our home state and highlighting our state as we are seeing attacks on voting rights across the U.S. In fact, in the last year alone, more than 400 bills have been introduced in 49 states across the United States restricting voting access. That includes barriers to mail-in voting, early voting, and voter ID laws, with dozens of these laws having been enacted in 2021 alone, not to mention the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the courts over the last several years. In light of these and other attacks on our core democratic institutions, it is more important than ever that we act at the federal level to protect voting rights. And that is why I am so proud to be a co-sponsor of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and why we are still fighting to get this bill, along with the Freedom to Vote Act and the For the People Act, across the finish line in the Senate. Taken together, these three bills would strengthen the Voting Rights Act, modernize and overhaul our election system to actually make it work for our communities, and most importantly, help get big money out of politics. However, as we saw in January of this last year, the Senate was unable to pass these bills in spite of overriding support from the American people due to outdated and undemocratic customs in the Senate that are being used to block critical legislation, which is why I too support and believe that we must abolish the filibuster. In spite of these challenges at the federal level, New Mexico has been at the forefront of promoting fair and open elections. In 2019 and 20, we passed major election reform bills allowing automatic and same-day registration, expanded early voting, and mail-in voting, which was especially important for our state at the height of the pandemic. And this last year, we passed the Native American Polling Place Protection Act to ensure that our tribes and our pueblos can provide access to the ballot box on tribal lands. While serving in the State House here in this Capitol, I was proud to support and vote in favor of these bills. However, as we're hearing here this morning, our work is not over. In the last election cycle, we've heard reports of local officials refusing to provide access to the ballot box on tribal lands, even at the request of our tribal governments, limited polling places in rural areas, forcing our rural communities to drive long distances to vote, and even instances of voter intimidation in communities with high numbers of new voters. We've also continued to see lower participation across low income and communities of color across the state, and our state has also not been immune to anti-democratic efforts to undermine the election at the national level, including several individuals from our state who are currently under federal investigation for acting as fake electors in the 2020 presidential election, and misinformation about that election that still is circulating within our state. And this, Mr. Chairman, is exactly why we must keep working to protect and expand voting rights, because our democracy and the ability of every New Mexican and every American, regardless of where you come from and where you live, to have your voice heard depends on it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm on limited time, so I will hold my questions to the second round.
Thank you. The young lady yields back, and thank you very much for your questions. I suppose it's my turn, but let me just begin by start the clock, not exempt the clock. Thank you. Thank you for mentioning the Voting Rights Act, John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. That's something that's very near to the, while the bill was actually written by the Judiciary Committee, this committee that had great input, great influence on the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a very significant legislation. It did several. First of all, it outlawed literacy tests that was in effect in many southern states. Big deal. Mexico might not have appreciation of what that meant in the South. It was very significant. It enabled persons who were not well educated to become registered voters. And it stopped election officials administering any type of pre-qualification of them. But it did also create Section 2, which gave any minority community in the United States, any minority community, the whole country, votes diluted, voters were being disenfranchised because of election laws, gave them the right to bring a lawsuit, federal court, challenge the election procedures. Section 2 is effective years ago that involved litigation. Not have made progress that we've made in this country, advancing minority voting rights, had it not been for Section 2. Third provision of the ERA was what we call Section 5. Some refer to it as the clearance section. It singled out certain states and parts of states that had a long history of voting discrimination. It ended up in most states of the South, 40 counties in my state of, but subjected these jurisdictions to pre-clearance, which means that before any election law, practice, or procedure would be enforced, it had to be cleared by the Department of Justice. And because of that, many southern states were placed in either to ignore Section 5 or comply with Section 5. Many states, believe it or not, ignored Section 5 to their peril. After the passage of several years, they called to account for their failure to get election laws, new election laws. Section 5 has been very meaningful and a lot to political progress that minority made all across the country. Well, in 2013, we were witness to grand surprise. Shelby County versus Boulder, June 5th, 2013, it was. The Supreme Court handed down a ruling that was very profound. Very interesting, I may say. It found that Section 5 is constitutional. You don't realize that. Some believe that Section 5 was struck down. Section 5 was not struck down. It is now, continues to be the law of the land. What was struck down was Section 4, which is the formula that decides which states, which counties, which cities are included in Section 5. And so the formula has been struck down as being out of date because the formula that was being used was a 1964 formula. The court said that Congress needs to update the formula. So this committee has been very much involved in creating fact basis, a congressional record that would support updating the formula for Section 5. And we completed that task. We were all over the country, last Congress, Congresswoman, then Congresswoman Marsha Budge, went to reservations in North Dakota. We held hearings there. North Carolina, we went to other states across the country. We held vast amounts of field hearings. We collected the evidence. We have thousands of pages of testimony and evidence that were included in the congressional record, which was the basis for passing on our Advancement Act. So we have now passed the House, leading action in the Senate. While we have encountered several obstacles, we hope those obstacles resolved in the next few weeks and we'll get this legislation passed and enacted in law. So rather than asking questions, I will make a speech because a lot of people don't connect the dots. Some things they don't really put the corners of the problem together in one neat package. And that's where. Thank you, and I will. All right, that completes the first round of questions. You all have an appetite for a second round? All right. All right. Are we streaming? Yeah. Okay. We have it in okay. Going once, twice, no response from any colleagues that might. All right, second round of questions. Let Fernandez take it away. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Butterfield. And yes, the Section 2 has been well used in New Mexico and litigated, and And I really believe, as you do, that we have no choice but to continue to work and put all of our effort into ensuring that the People to Vote Act and the John Lewis Act, which are now one as they should be, which passed the Senate last time with not a single negative Republican vote, 98-0, that we need to make sure that we get those 50 Republicans, or at least do away with the filibuster. Must work on that. But I wanted to turn right now to our wonderful Secretary of State, who has done so much, who has taught us that we can walk and chew gum, we can vote and make sure that voting is safe. We are working hard on the passage of those two laws that we talked about. But what else can we do in Congress to provide the assistance to you? You have the ears and eyes of the subcommittee on elections and the House administration. Describe to us what you need here from the federal government.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and Representative Fernandez. I think the biggest challenge that we face in the states, in addition to, my full belief that we need to pass this particular piece of legislation, and particularly to address the lack of a formula. It's my personal belief that a lot of the restrictive laws that we've seen passed, for example, just to the east and west of New Mexico and our neighboring states, would not have mustered past pre-clearance had that Section 4 formula been reestablished by now. And I appreciate your efforts in working toward that, because it's clear that we need it. We are creating a more unequal election process throughout the country without it. But to your question, Mr. Chair and Representative, we need ongoing funding that we can rely upon in the states. So, as you know, Mr. Chair and Representative, elections are critical national infrastructure. And we're not just talking about the cybersecurity aspect of elections, although that is incredibly critical. We are talking about the ability for voters to safely go to the polls, for our poll workers, our county clerks, to safely conduct their duties, and to make sure that we're providing that physical access to the place. One of the best ways we can do that, we are certainly grateful for the grants that we've received from Congress, particularly since I've been in office. We've put those to very good use here in the state of New Mexico and are continuing to take advantage of that funding. It's coming to us through HAVA, through the EAC. If we knew that we could rely on an even smaller amount of funding, but on an annual basis, to help support these critical infrastructure programs in our state, that would go a tremendously long way. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ferguson, can you describe, because you are taking a statewide, and we do know that there is both harassment of voters and, sadly, harassment of workers. When they should have the most boring job there is, right? All you're doing is counting the ballots, and they do it, and so many of them are on volunteer basis. But Ms. Ferguson, are there parts of the state, and is there work that can be done that are subject to kind of maybe worse practices that we need to target or think about, or are things going really well across the state, or are there some issues that we need to be aware of?
Mr. Chair and Representative Fernandez, I wish that I could say that there were certain areas of the state that were immune. Certainly in 2020, we did not experience that. We saw voter intimidation and harassment tactics happening down in Las Cruces in Doña Ana County. We saw a number of those happening in the southeastern corners of our state. We saw them right here in Albuquerque, and we also saw them in Santa Fe, all the way up through Farmington. There was no place that was immune from that. I think we can anticipate, based on the rhetoric and the divisiveness that is currently occurring, especially here in our state, with certain individuals who are trying to rally individuals to sow not only disinformation but disbelief and trust in our election systems, that we need greater protections, specific criminal legislation that will address it to be a crime to intimidate or to harass our poll workers who are there just trying to count ballots, as you said, and then specifically also to try to address these intimidation tactics, which include caravans of vehicles that were blocking our polling locations throughout
Thank
the
you,
city.
Ms. Ferguson. We actually do have federal legislation to address that, and we'll continue to work on it. But I think it's important to place into testimony the fact that still exists. I yield back, Chairman.
The lady yields back. Stansberry?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And one thing I would love to do, since we are in New Mexico and part of the purpose of these field hearings is to hear from folks who are out in the field, is to direct a question to Ms. Chavez. In this last election and in previous elections, we've seen instances where county officials, county election officials, have limited access to the ballot box in our tribal communities. And this was particularly problematic during the pandemic because we have communities, for example, in the Navajo Nation, where people usually vote at their chapter houses. They travel, as you said during your testimony, long distances, but there were curfews. People were trying to stay home to stay safe, and there was limitations put on access to the ballot box. Chapter house voting stations were not opened. We had CARES Act money to actually open those stations, but we had local officials who refused to actually take the money that was available at the request of, in this instance, the Navajo Nation to make those voting stations open. And so that, Mr. Chairman, is why we had passed this bill this last session and why that was so important for ensuring that our tribal nations could control access to the ballot box. But I think, Mr. Chairman, as you were pointing out, we're seeing suppression of Native votes across the country. And so, Ms. Chavez, I wonder if you could take a few moments to share about New Mexico's experience and what you feel in terms of both the challenges and successes can be scaled up at the federal level to make sure that we're protecting the Native.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Fernandez. I think there are a bunch of provisions nationally in the NAVR Act that make a lot of sense for tribes. When we had to deal with the pandemic and the closure, it really was because tribal communities were closing their borders to protect their elders and their community members, which, because of the code, meant that if that particular polling location wasn't accessible to every voter, they had to choose between voting and or closing that location. So we were able to rectify that with that piece of legislation. However, there are so many issues with not enough polling workers in a lot of these locations. There's issues with basic access for our disabled voters, right? Even something simple by allowing a polling worker to cast that or take that ballot outside of the actual building makes a big difference for a lot of our elderly voters. Anytime we reduce the hours and accessibility for early voting days, that means that a lot of our elders who need translation services or help getting into actual polling locations are limited. When we don't have the funding to be able to provide for translation or for allowing some of our people who work within our tribes to be able to help our voters, then we limit their access. So there's a number of small provisions that we can do at the national level. As Ms. Fernandez had mentioned, having tribal buildings be allowed to be the address for any sort of registered votership are very crucial. Anytime we're allowed to use our own tribal identifications to be able to vote, that means that we increase the votership. So there are a number of small provisions, small changes that can be made on the national level that we did try to incorporate in the New Mexico VRA, but those provisions were literally the provisions that we've been talking about on the national level with a number of organizations that work for Native American leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chavez. And Mr. Chairman, certainly as this committee moves forward and efforts in the Senate move forward to get voting rights legislation passed, I think it's crucial that we take these examples and really incorporate them into the voting rights laws we're working at the federal level specific to our tribal communities, because while the Voting Rights Act has provisions in it that protect communities that have historically been discriminated against, there are particularities in tribal communities that are really important because of the sovereign status of our tribal nations. And so I really wanted to take a moment to highlight that. Because I'm running low on time, I'd like to just ask one question to Ms. Serrano. I really appreciated in your testimony the ways in which you lifted up and talked about the importance of making voting more accessible and increasing turnout amongst our communities of color and our low-income communities. And I wonder if you could just share some thoughts about what we can do at the federal level in partnership with our local organizations and governments to really help make that happen more effectively.
I think a lot of people, the traditional hours of 7 to 7, which are pretty expansive, but I think that people are still struggling to get to the polls. And I think bigger than that, it's the misinformation. It's pressure from employers. It's family pressure, but it's also, we have folks who are working more than one job. And so, if I knew that one thing, that would have been the focal point of what I talked about today. But what I do think is at the heart here is that we have to really combat, one, the misinformation, but two, we have to make voting as accessible as possible. And New Mexico has taken such great strides toward that over the last few years. But, having drop boxes in lots more accessible places, I think, is one of those steps. Quite honestly, when we're talking about placing an importance on reaching out to communities of color, I think that, there's lots of voter information that's out there, but where are the places, and what is the investment that we need to make into finding the places and the trusted messengers? That's the other piece of it, is who are the trusted messengers in our communities who are bringing us that information, and how are we making it even more accessible for folks to vote? Whether it's Sunday voting, whether it's, there's lots of ideas that are out there around how do we make voting more accessible, even in a state that's as accessible as New Mexico. But what I really do think it comes down to is how are we getting information, correct information, to our communities in many different languages. That the misinformation that you spoke about, that we saw really take hold in Florida, we've seen it taking hold among other Latinos across the country, including in New Mexico. Who are those trusted messengers who are going to disrupt that misinformation? That misinformation is done purposely, and it's done specifically to keep people of color from trusting that their vote will matter when their votes absolutely do count and absolutely do matter.
Serrano, and I yield back.
Right, chair now recognizes himself. I got carried away a few minutes ago, about 5, and I ran out of time. I got carried away a few moments ago by talking about Section 5. Also, there's a case in the state of Texas working its way to the U.S. Supreme Court that challenges Section 2, that is the right to litigate. Their claim is that Section 2 is unconstitutional, plain and simple. But they also plead in the alternative that if Section 2 is constitutional, that it was not intended to apply to redistricting cases. They also intend, alternatively, that Section 2, in order to be successful, there must be intentional discrimination, not discriminatory result, intentional discrimination, or at the very least, bad faith on the part of the legislative making body. And so that case is working its way to the Supreme Court, and I hope the outcome will be, but we're bracing ourselves for that case to say that it's. Serrano, thank you for mentioning disinformation. I can get on my soapbox about that as well. I said in Florida, we were down there a few weeks ago, I guess it was, that there are 3 types of bad information. There is disinformation, misinformation, and what I call malinformation. Misinformation is true information, but it is not intended to hurt a candidate or a political cause. It's just misguided. But then there is misinformation, or should I say disinformation, that is false information that is intentional. It's intended to suppress the vote and to cause confusion in an election. Then there is malinformation that is malicious. It is just off the chart, just a lie that is spread through social media and otherwise. So thank you for bringing that up. Ms. Ferguson, let me start with you. In your testimony, you discussed Common Cause's robust election protection program. As you look ahead to to this year's elections, what are you most concerned about from a voter and election protection standpoint? And what can we do as Congress to address the situation?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. We do usually run a program where we have close to 1,000 volunteers out in the field. I think that's one of the most critical components of our campaign, is working with all 25 civic engagement organizations that we work with so that we have people on the ground, so that when we get calls into our national 1-866 Our Vote hotline that we run with the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, that we have people on the ground that can verify this information. That was what led us to what actually resulted in subsequent arrests of several individuals at one of our polling locations here. So I think that one of the things we're most concerned about right now is going to be voter intimidation, the malinformation and the disinformation that you specified too. I think is something that we've seen prevalently occurring on our social media sites and being propagated by some individuals. And I think that with that, the best help that we can have from Congress is to ensure that we have full access to all of our voting locations. There was a number of people who would come up against, lines of vehicles and felt genuinely intimidated, and understandably so, to even go near their location. 20.
Example of malinformation. If someone posts a statement, breaking news, polling places will be open 2 days, 7 to 7 on Tuesday, 7 to 7 on Wednesday. Make sure you vote by 7 p.m. on Wednesday. That is tendency, and especially when that is communicated, targeting, that's happening. Get worse unless. Secretary Oliver, you mentioned in your testimony that Mexico has not been immune to the increasing threats election officials faced across the election officials, as you certainly vital to our election. What can we help better protect officials in the state?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. I think it's really important first of all, for Congress to help us combat the misdis and malinformation. A lot of the threats that are arising towards myself and my colleagues, not just at the Secretary of State level, but at all levels of election administration, are coming directly from the lies that are being propagated about how our elections are run and about the accuracy and integrity of the 2020 election. I'm very pleased that the Department of Justice and FBI have convened their task force that provides us with a hotline and an outlet to report threats. They're being very responsive. I have to say my own personal experience dealing with threats and working together with the FBI and federal law enforcement has been fantastic. Anything you can do to help support those efforts is incredible. But I think most important is that we have to collectively figure out how to make sure that these lies are not tolerated and they do not continue to propagate, because that is the most dangerous piece of what we're dealing with here. Thank you.
Let me ask you this in conclusion. Are you charged with responsibility for certifying president after the popular vote? That is your responsibility? Yes. Is there any legislation in this state that would take away that authority, Secretary?
No, Mr. Chair, and it is not just my role. We have a statewide board of canvass that consists of myself, the governor, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. There has not been any legislation introduced. I haven't heard anything about that, and thank goodness, Mr. Chair.
You make that certification based on any political consideration, strictly follow the law?
Absolutely not, Mr. Chair. We strictly follow.
Well, I want to again thank witnesses for your valuable testimony today. Thank members for questions. Members may have additional questions for these witnesses, and if so, we will ask you to respond. Witnesses to respond to those in writing. Hearing record will be held for these responses. Yeah, just if you would suspend for just a moment. If you would suspend for just a moment. I have the authority to arrest you and detain you. Would you hold for just a moment? Would you hold for just a moment? Thank you. Thank you, gentlelady. Let me try that one again. That doesn't happen too often. It happens. You have patient citizens. they do this. I have a lot of power when hearing is disrupted. I'm not going to exercise that power. Thank you to the witnesses. Thank you to our colleagues. Colleagues, you may have additional questions for the witnesses, and so we will ask you to respond to those in writing. Hearing record will be held open response. Again, thank you to our host here at the Capitol. Thank you to my colleagues and to the good people of Mexico. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Elections will stand adjourned.